The Arizona Territory, a land of stark beauty and brutal indifference, stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed determined to scorch every living thing into submission. For Thomas "Tom" Miller, the heat was a constant, unwelcome companion, much like the gnawing emptiness that had taken root deep within him, a void carved out by years of isolated ranching and an unspoken history. His ranch, sprawling across acres of sun-baked earth, felt less like a testament to his toil and more like a vast monument to absence. The rhythmic lowing of his cattle, the persistent creak of the old windmill turning lazily in the thin breeze, and the ever-present scent of parched earth and hardy mesquite were the only familiar constants in a life that had become a desolate echo. He often sat on the porch swing, the aged wood groaning a quiet protest beneath his weight, his gaze fixed on the shimmering, distorted heat haze that danced above the distant horizon. Redemption, the nearest semblance of civilization, was a cluster of false-fronted buildings, a single dusty main street and a saloon that hummed with a low, constant murmur of gossip and judgment. Tom visited only when absolutely necessary for supplies, enduring the sidelong glances and the whispered condemnations that followed him like a shadow. He had arrived in this remote corner of the West years ago, seeking a fresh start, a new beginning, where the vastness of the land might just be expansive enough to swallow the burdens of his past. But the West, in its unforgiving honesty, had merely amplified his solitude, magnifying his internal landscape of loss rather than burying it. His eyes often drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the distant, jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. They rose sharply from the desert floor, a silent, imposing backdrop to his isolated existence. That was where Elara lived, or so the sparse whispers in Redemption claimed, an Apache woman, a widow, who stubbornly clung to a patch of land that even the most ambitious and land-hungry white settlers had deemed too wild, too untamable, too fiercely guarded by its previous inhabitants. Rumors about her were as thick and choking as the dust that billowed through the territory in the scorching summer months. Whispers of a woman who refused to abandon her ancestral lands, a woman who carried grief not as a burden, but as a shield, deflecting the unwanted intrusions of the outside world. Days bled into weeks, each one a monotonous cycle of grueling ranch work, silent, unshared meals, and the slow, inexorable march of loneliness. One particularly sweltering afternoon, as Tom rode his bay mare back from mending a fence line on the far South 40, a section of his property that felt almost as remote as the moon, he saw her. A lone figure, small and resilient against the immense vastness of the landscape, bent low near what was usually a dry creek bed, now little more than a dusty gash in the earth. She was struggling with a formidable pile of deadwood, her movements slow, deliberate, each swing of her meager, dull hatchet looking impossibly labored under the oppressive, unforgiving sun. He watched her for a long moment, unmoving on his horse, a flicker of something unidentifiable stirring deep within him. It wasn't pity, not in the traditional sense. It was something akin to a silent, profound recognition of shared burden, a quiet, unspoken understanding of what it truly meant to fight against a world that seemed relentlessly determined to break you, to force you into submission. He continued his ride, circling wide to pass her without intrusion, not wanting to draw attention to either of them. The unwritten rules of the frontier dictated a certain distance, especially between white settlers and indigenous people, a chasm of suspicion and fear that few dared to bridge. But even as he dismounted at his dusty corral, the image of her struggling, her small frame dwarfed by the towering pile of gnarled wood she was attempting to gather, remained stubbornly fixed in his mind. He knew the effort it took, the bone-deep ache that would surely follow, the way exhaustion could settle into your very bones, leaving you hollow and spent. He looked at his own axe, a sturdy, well-balanced tool forged from tempered steel, its wooden handle smooth from countless hours of use, leaning against the weathered side of his barn. It was a good axe, sharp enough to split seasoned oak, heavy enough to fell small trees, certainly capable of much more than just chipping away at sun-baked deadwood. A quiet decision formed in his mind, unburdened by conscious thought or the usual frontier prejudices. It was an impulse born not of a desire for connection, but from a deeper, almost primal sense of shared hardship. Later that evening, under the cloak of twilight, a time when the desert air began to cool and the first stars pricked the indigo sky, he rode out again. The journey was short, only a few miles from his ranch. He found her wagon, a rickety, unpainted contraption, parked a little way off from her lean-to shelter, a rudimentary structure of hides and salvaged wood. The air was still, save for the distant, mournful howl of a coyote, a sound that always seemed to embody the loneliness of the West. He approached silently, dismounted, his boots barely disturbing the loose dust, and walked to the wagon. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around for any unseen observers. With a practiced, almost reverent motion, he slid his axe onto the worn bed of the wagon, nestling it carefully against a bundle of scrawny, brittle branches she had already managed to collect. The cold steel felt solid in his hand for a moment before he released it. He didn't linger, didn't look back, didn't wait to see if she would emerge. The act was its own quiet reward, a silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity, in a world that often seemed determined to deny it, to separate people into rigid, unyielding categories. He rode back to his ranch, the growing darkness a comforting, enveloping blanket. The profound emptiness inside him hadn't vanished, not entirely, but for the first time in a long while, it felt a little less vast, a little less consuming, as if a small, almost imperceptible seed of something new had been planted. He didn't know if she would understand the gesture, or even if she would notice the sturdy, well-made tool among her meager collection of firewood. But the simple act had, in some small way, broken the crushing monotony of his isolation, if only for a fleeting moment. He slept more soundly that night than he had in weeks. The image of the axe, its dark steel glinting faintly in the last sliver of fading light on her wagon, a quiet, unexpected testament to a connection he hadn't known he yearned for, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of fear and prejudice. The first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, a fleeting beauty that often went unnoticed by those consumed by the harsh realities of the frontier. For Ilara, however, the dawn was a sacred time, a moment of quiet reflection before the relentless demands of the day began. She emerged from her lean-to shelter, a structure built with a practiced hand from salvaged timber and stretched hides, its entrance facing east to greet the rising sun. Her movements were fluid, economical, honed by years of living close to the earth. Her long, dark hair, still damp from the morning's ritual washing, cascaded down her back, catching the nascent light. Her first task, as it always was to tend to the small, smouldering fire pit, coaxing the embers back to life for the morning's meager meal. But as she turned towards her wagon, her eyes, accustomed to spotting the slightest anomaly in the vast landscape, immediately registered the unfamiliar. Nestled amongst the bundles of brittle mesquite and scrub oak she had painstakingly gathered the previous day, lay a tool that was decidedly not hers. It was a well-crafted axe, its steel head gleaming dully in the pre-dawn light, its wooden handle smooth and dark with age and use. It was a far cry from her own small chipped hatchet, a tool that had served her faithfully but was clearly nearing the end of its useful life. A ripple of surprise, quickly followed by a prickle of caution, moved through her. Who could have left it, and why? Her mind, sharp and wary from years of navigating a world that was often hostile, sifted through the possibilities. Bandits would have taken her meager supplies, not left something of value. Other Apache, even those who viewed her with suspicion for her solitary ways, would have announced their presence or left a sign. White settlers, particularly those from Redemption, rarely ventured this far from their established paths, and certainly not to offer gifts. Their interactions were almost always marked by suspicion, fear, or outright aggression. She picked up the axe, testing its weight. It was perfectly balanced, the blade keen to the touch. This was not a cast-off tool. It was a cared-for instrument, a rancher's axe. A single clear thought formed in her mind. Thomas Miller. She had seen his ranch in the distance, a solitary outpost much like her own. She had also seen him occasionally riding his bay mare, a silent, imposing figure against the vastness. She remembered seeing him yesterday, riding past her as she struggled with the firewood. He had not stopped, had not acknowledged her presence, yet here was his axe. The gesture was profoundly unsettling, yet undeniably kind. It was an act that defied the unspoken rules of the frontier, a quiet offering that transcended the chasm of racial and cultural divide. It was a silent acknowledgement of her struggle, a practical solution to a problem she had been facing alone. Ilara, a woman who had learned to trust only herself and the wisdom of her ancestors, found herself grappling with an unexpected emotion, a flicker of gratitude, quickly tempered by a deep-seated wariness. What did he want? Was this a prelude to something else, something less benign? She spent the morning working with the new axe. It bit into the deadwood with an ease that made her own hatchet feel like a child's toy. The work that had taken hours now took a fraction of the time, the wood splitting cleanly, efficiently, As she worked, her mind kept returning to the rancher. She knew his kind. They took land, they took resources, they rarely gave anything without expectation of return. Yet this was different. There was no demand, no expectation, just the axe. The following days were marked by an unusual tension for Ilara. She found herself scanning the horizon more frequently, her eyes drawn to the distant silhouette of Tom Miller's ranch. She saw him sometimes a small figure on horseback, moving through his fields. He never approached, never lingered. It was as if the axe had been an anonymous gift, a fleeting moment of connection that was not meant to be acknowledged. This silence, this lack of follow-up, only deepened the mystery and paradoxically began to chip away at her ingrained suspicion. Meanwhile, in Redemption, the whispers about Ilara had begun to intensify. The town, a microcosm of frontier society, thrived on gossip and rigid social structures. Jedediah Thorne, the town's fire and brimstone preacher, was a man whose influence extended far beyond the walls of his small, whitewashed church. He saw the world in stark terms of black and white, good and evil, and the presence of an Apache woman living so close to their Christian settlement was, in his eyes, an affront to God and decency. He preached sermons filled with thinly veiled warnings about the dangers of the heathen and the need for a pure community. It wasn't long before the sight of Tom Miller's axe in Ilara's wagon was noticed by a passing prospector, a man known for his loose tongue and his thirst for whiskey. The news, distorted and embellished, quickly reached Redemption. "Miller's gone soft," one man muttered in the saloon, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty floor. "Leaving his tools for an Apache. What's next? Inviting her to Sunday service?" Jedediah Thorne seized upon the rumor with righteous indignation. From his pulpit, his voice booming with a self-assured authority, he declared that such fraternization was a sign of moral decay, a dangerous blurring of lines that God himself had drawn. "We must remain vigilant, my flock," he thundered, his eyes sweeping over the congregation, many of whom shifted uncomfortably in their pews. "The wilderness outside our walls is not just of rock and sand, but of temptation and ungodliness. We must guard our purity, lest we be corrupted by the darkness that lurks in the shadows." Tom, oblivious to the storm brewing in town, continued his solitary existence. He had made his gesture, a quiet act of defiance against the loneliness that had consumed him. He didn't expect a response, didn't even know if Ilara had noticed the axe or understood its silent message. Yet a subtle shift had occurred within him. The emptiness remained, but it was no longer quite as suffocating. There was a faint, almost imperceptible thread of connection, a shared secret between him and the distant Apache widow. One afternoon, a week after he had left the axe, Tom rode into Redemption for supplies. The air in the general store was thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and unwashed bodies. He felt the eyes on him, the sudden silence that fell as he entered. He ignored it, as he always did, heading straight for the flour sacks. But then Jedediah Thorne's voice, sharp and accusatory, cut through the quiet. "Mr. Miller," the preacher began, his tone dripping with thinly veiled contempt, "it has come to my attention that you have been extending courtesies to certain individuals outside the bounds of our community." Tom turned slowly, his hand still resting on a sack of cornmeal. His eyes, usually guarded, met Thorne's with a steely resolve. "I don't know what you're talking about, preacher." "Oh, I think you do," Thorne pressed, stepping closer, his face a mask of self-righteous indignation. "A certain axe, Mr. Miller, found in the possession of that heathen woman who squats on the land near the mountains. A gift, perhaps, a token of friendship." The last word was spat out like a curse. A muscle twitched in Tom's jaw. He knew now. The silent gesture had not remained silent for long. "It was an axe, preacher, nothing more. A tool." "A tool, indeed," Thorne scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "A tool that speaks volumes, Mr. Miller, volumes about where your loyalties lie, volumes about the kind of influence you invite into our God-fearing community. Be warned, sir, such actions do not go unnoticed, and they will not go unpunished." Tom said nothing more. He paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. He could feel the weight of every eye in the store, the silent condemnation. As he left, the whispers resumed, louder now, more confident. He mounted his mare, the sun still high in the sky, but the warmth seemed to have vanished, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silent offering had been seen, and now it had become a beacon, drawing the unwanted attention of a world determined to keep them apart. He rode back to his ranch, the vast empty landscape suddenly feeling even more isolating than before, but now also strangely charged with a new, dangerous purpose. The quiet act of kindness had, inadvertently, ignited a conflict far greater than he could have imagined. The return ride to Tom Miller's ranch after his encounter with Preacher Thorne in Redemption was a solitary, tension-filled affair. The sun, which had felt oppressive moments before, now seemed to cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the vast, empty landscape. Every gust of wind carried the imagined whispers of the townsfolk. Every distant sound seemed to echo Thorne's condemning words. Tom felt a familiar knot tightening in his gut, the same feeling that had driven him to this isolated life in the first place, a life lived on the fringes precisely to avoid the judgment and intrusion of others. He'd sought peace in the endless plains, but it seemed even here, far from the madding crowd, the long arm of human prejudice could reach him. He dismounted at his barn, the familiar scents of hay and horse sweat, a small comfort in the turmoil of his thoughts. He unsaddled his mare, his movements precise and automatic, a routine born of years. The preacher's words replayed in his mind, sharp and cutting, unpunished. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise in a town where Thorne's word held sway. Tom wasn't a man given to grand pronouncements or open defiance, but a stubborn resolve hardened within him. He had left that axe not as a political statement or an act of rebellion, but as a simple gesture of human decency. The idea that such a small act could stir such a storm of righteous indignation was, to him, both ludicrous and deeply unsettling. It highlighted the vast unbridgeable chasm of misunderstanding and ingrained prejudice that separated his world from Ilara's. Meanwhile, Ilara, unaware of the specific conversation in Redemption's general store, felt the shift in the air just as keenly. The subtle vibrations of fear and animosity that radiated from the white settlement were as tangible to her as the changing seasons. She knew instinctively that the axe, her newfound invaluable tool, had become a symbol. She had noticed the increased frequency of riders on the distant trail that skirted her land, not just solitary prospectors, but small groups, their eyes lingering on her dwelling for a moment too long. She saw the dust plumes rise and fall with more purpose, the riders sometimes pausing on a distant ridge watching. One afternoon, as she worked near her lean-to, splitting firewood with a practiced ease the new axe afforded her, a rider approached, kicking up a plume of fine red dust. It wasn't Tom Miller. This was a younger man, brash and confident, a cowboy from one of the larger ranches closer to Redemption. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt a good distance from her, his hand resting conspicuously on the pistol at his hip. "You the Apache woman," he called out, his voice rough, laced with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled menace. Ilara paused her work, the axe head resting on a block of wood. She straightened slowly, her gaze steady, unblinking. She did not speak, her silence a challenge. The cowboy shifted uncomfortably, momentarily unnerved by her quiet defiance. "Folks in town are talking," he continued, pushing past his discomfort. "About that axe. Looks mighty fine for a squaw's tool." He let the slur hang in the air, a deliberate provocation. Ilara's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but her face remained impassive. She simply looked at him, her gaze conveying a depth of resilience and warning that transcended words. "Just a friendly warning," the cowboy stammered, his bravado wavering under her unwavering stare. "You best be careful living out here. Folks don't take kindly to certain things. Best not to stir up trouble." He fidgeted, then, without waiting for a response, reined his horse around and spurred it back the way he came, eager to escape her silent judgment. Ilara watched him go, a grim understanding settling over her. So, the axe was known, and the man who left it. The gesture, intended as a kindness, had exposed them both. The frontier, for all its vastness, was a small world when it came to gossip and prejudice. She understood the cowboy's veiled threat. It wasn't just about the axe. It was about the perceived breach of an invisible yet ironclad boundary. White and Apache did not simply exchange tools. Such interactions were seen as dangerous, a weakening of the societal walls that kept the civilized separate from the savage. She thought of Tom Miller. He was different from the others. His eyes held a quiet sadness, a weariness she recognized, but his actions, however well-intentioned, had drawn the unwanted attention of a community that saw her only as the other, a potential threat, never a person. She knew the history, the broken treaties, the constant encroachment. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, yet this man had offered a simple, practical gift. It was a paradox that gnawed at her, a crack in the hardened shell of her self-reliance. Back at his ranch, Tom found himself increasingly isolated. His occasional trips into redemption became fraught with tension. The general store owner, usually cordial, was now curt and distant. Men he'd known for years would avert their gaze or offer a strained nod rather than a friendly word. The only exception was old Silas, the blacksmith, a gruff but fair man who lived by his own code. "Heard Preacher Thorne's been preaching hellfire about you, Tom," Silas grunted one afternoon as Tom picked up a mended piece of equipment. Tom merely shrugged. "He's got his opinions." Silas wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "Opinions that can sour a whole town. Be careful, son. Thorne's got a way of whipping folks up. They start seeing shadows where there ain't none." He paused, then looked Tom squarely in the eye. "That Apache woman, she's had enough trouble. Best leave her be for her own sake, and yours." The advice, though well-meant, chafed at Tom. It wasn't about trouble. It was about a simple act of human connection. But Silas's words, coupled with the cowboy's warning to Ilara, painted a stark picture of the mounting pressure. The obstacles were becoming clearer, not just the physical dangers of the West, but the relentless, insidious threat of prejudice and communal wrath. Tom understood that his continued association, however unspoken with Ilara, could put her in even greater peril. He was a white man, albeit an ostracized one, but she, an Apache woman living alone, was far more vulnerable to the town's collective fear and hatred. A few days later, a small group of men led by Jedediah Thorne rode past Tom's ranch on their way to what Thorne called a community patrol. Their eyes lingered on his property, a silent declaration of scrutiny. Tom watched them from his porch, a cold dread seeping into his bones. They weren't just riding by, they were making a point. They were watching him, and by extension, they were watching Ilara. The silent kindness of the axe had unwittingly become a beacon, drawing unwanted attention to the very person he had tried, in his own quiet way, to ease the burden of. The weight of this unintended consequence pressed heavily on him. He had acted on impulse, on a flicker of empathy, but the world around him was not built for such quiet gestures across racial divides. It was a world of rigid lines, of us and them, and his act had blurred those lines, drawing the ire of those who fiercely guarded them. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that the situation was escalating. The whispers were turning into rumblings, and rumblings on the frontier often preceded a storm. He had to consider Ilara's safety. But how do you warn someone you've only ever shared a silent exchange with? How do you protect someone when your very presence seems to invite danger? The stark reality of the Wild West's racial tensions was no longer a distant concern. It had become an immediate personal threat, closing in on both him and the woman he had only ever seen from afar. The loneliness that had defined his life now felt irrevocably intertwined with a growing sense of responsibility, a silent burden laid upon him by a single misplaced axe. The community patrol, led by Jedediah Thorne, had marked a distinct escalation in the simmering tensions. Their ride past Tom Miller's ranch was not merely a show of force, it was a clear declaration of intent. Tom felt it in the tightening of his jaw, in the grim set of his shoulders as he watched their dust disappear over the horizon. The lines were being drawn, stark and unforgiving, and he, through a simple act of empathy, had found himself caught squarely in the middle. The loneliness that had always been his shield was now a vulnerability, exposing him to the judgment of a town that increasingly saw him as an outsider, a renegade. He knew he couldn't simply ignore the mounting pressure. The thought of Ilara isolated and vulnerable weighed heavily on him. He had seen the fear and the ingrained prejudice in the eyes of the townsfolk, and he understood the danger that lay in such unchecked animosity. If they were willing to harass him, a white man, for a perceived transgression, what might they do to an Apache woman living alone on the fringe of their settlement? The question gnawed at him, pushing him towards an uncomfortable yet unavoidable confrontation. He spent the next few days in a brooding silence, working his ranch with a renewed intensity, as if the physical labor could somehow quell the storm brewing inside him. But the image of Ilara struggling with firewood, then wielding his axe with such unexpected proficiency, kept returning. It wasn't just the axe anymore. It was the silent understanding, the fragile thread of connection that had formed between them. He felt a responsibility, not born of obligation but of a deeper human impulse. One sweltering afternoon, with the sun at its zenith, casting long, sharp shadows, Tom rode into Redemption. This time, he wasn't there for supplies. He rode directly to the small clapboard church, its whitewashed exterior gleaming starkly against the dusty street. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the front door. He didn't knock. He simply pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jedediah Thorne was seated at a small desk near the altar, poring over a large leather-bound Bible. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Tom. A smirk, laced with self-satisfaction, touched the preacher's lips. "Mr. Miller, to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" His tone was laced with condescension, the implication clear. Tom was there to be chastised, to repent. "I'm here about your talk, preacher," Tom stated, his voice low, steady, devoid of emotion. He walked further into the empty church, the creak of his boots echoing in the quiet space. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something cloying like stale piety. Thorne closed his Bible with a decisive thud. "My talk, Mr. Miller, is of God's word, of righteousness and purity, something it seems you might do well to heed." He rose from his seat, puffing out his chest, attempting to project an aura of moral superiority. "It's about what you're saying in town," Tom corrected, ignoring the preacher's posturing. "About me, and about Ilara." He used her name deliberately, letting it hang in the air, a challenge to the preacher's dehumanizing rhetoric. Thorne's eyes flashed with anger. "That heathen woman, she is a blight, Mr. Miller, a constant reminder of the darkness we strive to keep at bay, and your fraternization with her is an offense, not just to this community, but to the Lord himself." He gestured wildly with his hand, as if swatting away an invisible swarm of insects. Tom remained calm, his voice unwavering. "She is a woman trying to live her life. She causes no harm. And leaving an axe, preacher, is not an act of sin. It's an act of decency, something you might preach more of." Thorne recoiled as if struck. "Decency? You call consorting with savages, leaving gifts for them, decency?" His voice rose, vibrating with outrage. "That kind of loose behavior, Mr. Miller, undermines everything we stand for. It invites trouble. It invites retribution." The word hung in the air, cold and menacing. Tom felt a surge of cold fury. "Retribution? From whom, preacher? From God or from you and your pious mob?" Thorne's face reddened, but he quickly regained his composure, a chillingly calm resolve settling over his features. "From those who uphold God's law, Mr. Miller, from those who believe in order and purity. This town will not stand by and watch its moral fabric unravel. You would do well to sever all ties with that woman, for her sake and for yours. There are ways of ensuring compliance." Tom's eyes bored into Thorne's. He saw the cold fanaticism there, the unyielding conviction that justified any action in the name of righteousness. He knew then that talking, reasoning, would be futile. Thorne wasn't interested in understanding. He was interested in control. "I understand you perfectly, preacher," Tom said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but with an underlying steel that resonated in the quiet church. "And you understand me. My ranch is my own. My actions are my own, and what I choose to do or not do is not your concern." He turned to leave, but Thorne's voice, sharp and triumphant, stopped him at the door. "Mark my words, Mr. Miller. This will not end well. You are testing the patience of God-fearing men." Tom didn't respond. He simply walked out, the heavy door thudding shut behind him, sealing him once more in the blinding sunlight and the oppressive heat. He mounted his horse, the confrontation leaving him drained but also strangely resolute. He had drawn his own line. He had, in his quiet way, declared his position, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that this act of defiance would only further solidify the town's animosity towards him. As he rode away from Redemption, the dust rising in plumes behind him, he noticed a new development. A small group of men, 4 or 5 of them, were gathered near the outskirts of town, their horses restive. They watched him, their faces grim, and Tom recognized some of them as regular churchgoers, men who hung on Thorne's every word. He knew what their presence meant. He wasn't just being watched anymore, he was being marked. The warning had been delivered, and now the consequences were beginning to manifest. The obstacles he faced were no longer subtle whispers or distant glares. They were tangible threats, growing in number and boldness, forcing him further into a confrontation he had never sought. He glanced towards the distant mountains, towards Ilara's isolated dwelling. The silence between them had become a fragile truce in a war he hadn't asked to join, but one he was now undeniably a part of. The fate of that quiet shared gesture, the axe, had set them both on a collision course with a prejudiced world, and the dust of that collision was already beginning to settle. The sun beat down with an unrelenting fury, but it was the cold dread, not the heat, that chilled Tom Miller to the bone as he rode away from redemption. Preacher Thorne's veiled threats and the grim faces of the men on the town's outskirts were not just warnings. They were a declaration of war, not against an enemy nation, but against a quiet Apache woman, and by association, against him. The silent pact of the axe had indeed become a catalyst, forcing him out of his chosen isolation and into a conflict he'd never anticipated. He rode hard, the rhythmic thud of his mare's hooves, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. His ranch, usually a sanctuary, felt like a temporary waypoint now. He needed to think, to plan. The question was, what could one man do against the collective will of a prejudiced town? He had no illusions of being a hero, no grand notions of changing hearts and minds. His concern was simpler, more primal, to prevent harm, to prevent them from reaching Ilara. He worked his ranch that evening and the following morning with a heightened sense of urgency, his senses acutely attuned to the distant sounds and sights. He scanned the horizon incessantly, watching for dust plumes, listening for the telltale thrum of distant horses. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken menace. He knew they wouldn't wait long. Thorne's fanaticism, coupled with the simmering fear and ignorance of the townsfolk, was a volatile combination. Meanwhile, Ilara too felt the encroaching shadow. The cowboy's veiled warning had been followed by more frequent sightings of riders skirting her land, sometimes pausing on distant rises, their faces turned in her direction. She noticed the fresh tracks near her spring, distinct boot prints that were not her own. The air, usually alive with the sounds of the desert, now carried an unsettling silence, broken only by the whispers of the wind, which seemed to carry a premonition of danger. She was a woman who understood survival, who had faced loss and hardship with an unyielding spirit. She knew the signs. Trouble was coming. She sharpened the axe Tom had left, the steel singing against the whetstone. It was a tool, yes, but also a symbol now, a tangible link to the man who had inexplicably offered a kindness in a world that offered none. She moved with a quiet purpose, checking her small cache of supplies, ensuring her rifle was clean and loaded. Her lean-to might be humble, but she knew the terrain around it intimately. She would not be caught unprepared. Her grief for her lost family had forged her into something unyielding, a force of nature as resilient as the ancient mountains that watched over her. Then, on the second afternoon after Tom's confrontation in Redemption, he saw it, a distinct cloud of dust rising on the trail from town, larger than a solitary rider, too purposeful for casual travel. He grabbed his rifle, loaded his pistol and swung into his saddle. He didn't hesitate. He spurred his mare, riding hard, angling to intercept them before they reached her. He pushed the mare to her limit, across the uneven terrain, the wind whipping his hair, the sun beating down mercilessly. His heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of frantic urgency. He saw them before they saw him, a group of 5 men, led predictably by Jedediah Thorne, who rode at the front, his gaunt face set in a grim, determined mask. They were armed, some with rifles, others with pistols holstered at their hips. They were riding towards Ilara's dwelling, their intent clear, their purpose righteous in their own deluded minds. Tom intercepted them a half-mile from Ilara's lean-to, cutting across their path, his mare rearing slightly as he brought her to a sudden halt. The men pulled up sharply, their horses snorting and stamping, surprised by his sudden appearance. "Miller!" Thorne barked, his eyes widening in a mixture of surprise and furious indignation. "What in tarnation are you doing?" Tom's rifle was leveled, not quite aimed, but held in a manner that left no doubt about his intent. His voice was low, strained but firm. "You turn back, preacher, all of you. You're not going near her." "This is none of your concern, Miller," one of the other men, a large, burly rancher named Frank, growled, reaching for his pistol. "That squaw's a menace, and she needs to be run off." "She's a woman living her life," Tom retorted, his gaze sweeping over each man, holding their eyes for a beat. "She's caused no one harm. You're riding out here with malice in your hearts, dressed up in God's name." Thorne, recovering from his initial shock, spurred his horse forward a few paces, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "This is an abomination, Miller. You defend this heathen? You defy the will of this town, the will of God?" His voice rose to a crescendo, echoing across the desolate landscape. "We aim to ensure the safety and purity of redemption, and that means removing threats. The only threat I see is 5 armed men riding to terrorize a lone woman," Tom stated, his voice now colder, sharper. "You go further, and you'll answer to me." He shifted the rifle slightly, a clear, silent threat. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but a fierce, protective instinct had taken root, overriding caution. A tense silence fell, broken only by the snorting of horses and the distant cry of a hawk. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were brave in a mob, righteous behind a pulpit, but faced with a lone, determined man with a rifle, their resolve wavered. They were bullies, not warriors, and Tom's quiet conviction, his clear willingness to use force, unnerved them. Then, a flicker of movement from Ilara's lean-to. She had heard the commotion, seen the confrontation. She emerged, her rifle held steadily in her hands, its barrel glinting in the harsh sunlight. Her face was impassive, but her stance spoke of an unyielding resolve. She stood not as a victim, but as a sentinel, ready to defend her ground. Her presence, a silent testament to her strength, solidified the uncertainty in the men's eyes. They had expected a cowering woman. They found an unbowed warrior. Thorn, seeing her, swelled with renewed indignation. "There, see! A savage, armed and ready to strike. She proves my point," he shrieked. But his words lacked their former power. The other men, caught between Thorn's fire and Ilara's steady gaze, between Tom's unwavering rifle and the stark reality of facing 2 armed individuals, began to falter. Frank, the burly rancher, swallowed hard, his hand still on his pistol but not drawing it. This was no longer a simple act of intimidation. It was a potential bloodbath, and they suddenly realized they were outmatched in resolve, if not in numbers. "This ain't worth it, preacher," Frank muttered, glancing nervously at Tom, then at Ilara. "She ain't alone, and he ain't backing down." Slowly, reluctantly, the men began to rein their horses around. Thorn protested, his voice cracking with frustrated rage, but the momentum had shifted. His followers were losing their nerve. With a final venomous glare at Tom and Ilara, Thorn wheeled his horse and galloped back towards redemption, his patrol following, their initial bravado replaced by a palpable sense of defeat. Tom watched them go, his rifle still slightly raised, his body tense until their dust cloud faded into the distant shimmer. Then slowly he lowered his weapon, a profound weariness washing over him. He turned his mare towards Ilara's dwelling. Ilara had not moved. She still stood, rifle in hand, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no suspicion, only a quiet acknowledgement. He dismounted a respectful distance from her, the sun still high, the silence between them now different, not empty, but filled with unspoken understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had put himself between her and danger, a silent testament to the bond that had begun with a simple axe. Ilara's gaze met his, and for a long moment, something passed between them, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of prejudice and quiet courage. It wasn't a promise of an easy future. The West remained a harsh, unforgiving land, and redemption's prejudices wouldn't vanish overnight. But in that moment, in the vast, dusty silence, a different kind of connection had taken root, a fragile yet resilient bridge between 2 solitary souls. The axe, once a mere tool, had become a symbol of a rare, defiant understanding, a quiet beacon in a world determined to keep them apart.